Let's welcome on the stage Cilliers Brink. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mike. I trust everyone can hear me. You certainly can't accuse Mike Sham of being a Pollyanna, of being a little Miss Sunshine. So thank you very much for that introduction, Mike. And you also started with a paar warm klappe, as we say in Pretoria. I'm not going to respond to each and every one of them. I watched parts of that last breakfast that you had with JJ, Tshwane, and Herzog. And me and Corne and Musi were talking, and we'll try our best to give you as much drama and as much conflict as you had at the last breakfast. But on a serious note, folks, I think the frustration articulated at many of these events is not that there is nobody fighting for the important changes, articulating the necessary changes that need to happen, trying their best to achieve the reforms. The frustration is rather that those folks don't have enough power to actually land those changes, to see them through. And we must never lose hope of that possibility. So let me be a little bit more optimistic and take a longer view of our politics, especially looking at the local government election, which is likely to happen in the first week of November 2026. I do believe, and I say this not as a researcher in Parliament, or as a media spokesperson, or as somebody who worked with a theory of politics. I have been in the trenches. I have been hit, and I've survived to come back and to stick around. And I do believe that 2026 can be a turning point for South Africa's 257 municipalities, or at least the urban municipality, where the politics is changing, but especially the Gauteng metro that are so important to the economy and to the rest of society. I do believe that the changes at that election can enable us to restore a measure of stability to our water and electricity supply by partnering with the private sector, implementing some of the reforms that government is only now considering on the periphery. Concessions on water reticulation, private concessions on water reticulation and sewage reticulation, in the same way that government is now conceding that we need private concessions to run our ports and our rails. I do believe we can make the changes to deploy technology to make the work of municipal officials productive, to hold them accountable, but also to give them the tools of trade to actually do the work. And by doing that, we can even fill some of the gaps left by national governments, in particular the South African intermediate. I have seen some incredible things being done here in this country. And I won't hold up Cape Town as an example of what can be achieved everywhere, because that was achieved on the back of 2 decades of DA majority government. Whereas in the rest of the country, we have to adapt to the reality of coalition. But the ability of Cape Town's Metro Police today, and yes, there's gang violence that requires the national police, that requires crime intelligence, but the ability to use technology, cameras, dash cams, body cams, to collect electronic data, to actually pinpoint where Metro Police are, and then to dispatch them like you would dispatch an Uber driver to go and address the problems of crime. Those solutions are there. And no, it's not all capable states and good government. A lot of it, as I mentioned before, depends on the willingness to take hands with the private sector. We can do that, but there's an important condition. The ANC will necessarily have to be relegated to second or third place, especially in the metro, And the parties who are in favor of reform will need a clear mandate. Now, I say that as a party who wants to be the leader, the anchor tenant of coalition. Of course, there will be coalition. That's the reality. But let's not fool ourselves into thinking that coalitions are a good in and of themselves. We have seen that the ANC exploits the chaos and the uncertainty and the big egos and the small party in coalition in order to perpetuate its own predominance. So that even if the ANC gets chucked out of power, they can use cadres and tenderpreneurs and the Gauteng provincial government to overcome that election setback and to continue to implement its program in government. So, I think we've learned enough to know that parties like Action SA and the Patriotic Alliance handed Joburg and Pretoria back to the ANC, not because the DA was arrogant, not because we didn't greet somebody at some coalition meeting, but because those parties were predisposed. They were predisposed to be sucked into the ANC's hegemony and to be bought off. Because they don't hold elective Congress. They're not tethered by any worldview or any discernible ideology. They readily tell you at one election, we will never work with the ANC under any circumstance. And without blushing, they betray that mandate. We know that parties assisted the ANC in Parliament to pass VAT, assisted the ANC to try and undermine the government of national unity and the decision-making table there. And they did it because they're predisposed to the ANC's predominance and helping that party maintain it. Now, Mike, I am no cheerleader of the government of national unity. I am not uncritical about what it has achieved or not achieved. There are, of course, many reasons why that government of national unity was formed, and many reasons why the people of this country, including many of you, don't want us to simply withdraw from that government of national unity and leave a void. So it's not about believing that Cyril Ramaphosa has got a compelling, bold vision for the future, because he does not. It's not about believing that he will undertake the necessary reforms, because he's shown us at every turn that he won't. It is about trusting him even less if he has to depend for his tenure of office on a party such as the EFF, or even some of these smaller parties that the ANC used to try and pass a VAT hike. So it is a politics of necessity, but that's not the vision for the future of the country, and that's certainly not the headspace for going into the 2026 local government election. Because you are quite right, it has become evident that even with as little as 40% of the vote, the ANC is not interested in sharing power. It is not interested in undertaking fundamental supply-side reform to get the investment, to get the jobs, to make it easier for people to make a living, and to leave some wealth, not poverty, but wealth, for the next generation. And that's an important lesson as we prepare for the outcome or even the election campaign of 2026. Because you see, the president could have done the following. He could have said, I count together the votes of the ANC and the DA, other parties as well, certainly the Freedom Front Plus and many others who do believe in reform. And as a president, I now claim a new mandate, which will allow me to do what I failed to do in my 8 years in office. And to the extent that government is now doing certain things, such as starting with private concessions on ports and rails, and some of the reform at Eskom. That's good, but that's a response to economic necessity. It's not a thing of fundamental conviction. And that you have to understand about the ANC. What's unfortunate is that all of that stuff, which has been packaged as Operation Vulindlela, has not prompted the ANC and the president to make certain concessions on, for example, NHI, which in essence is an attempt to nationalize healthcare. It has not prompted them to make concessions on the Expropriation Act, to make it easier to understand that that act won't give you in order to strip people of private property. It hasn't prompted them to make concessions on preferential procurement, which leads to price gouging and bad value for taxpayers' money. And it hasn't prompted them to look at the Employment Equity Amendment Act, which imposes hard racial quotas at the pain of turnover penalties if companies don't implement what the Minister of Labour said you must do in terms of racial quotas in the workplace. In all of these instances, and here is an example, Mike, where people aren't just talking, but fighting. The solutions aren't being devised at the decision-making table of the governments of national unity, but in the law court. And this is the irony. The ANC's failure to make these concessions, to be open to joint policy making, has meant that they have even lost the opportunities which many dominant parties or large parties and coalitions have to co-opt the opposition. They didn't even try to co-opt. They just flatly refused to share power. And that has meant that there is still a space. There is still an opposition effectively. It's as Boris Johnson calls it, cakeism, having your cake and eating it. We have to be in the government of national unity, but equally we've got to fight in court against all of these bad policies. And we've secured some fundamental wins, I think you have to concede. So the ANC has to be tenderized. And by that, I don't mean granting more tenders. I mean softened up. Because 40% is too much. And they can't be the biggest party in Johannesburg, in Tshwane, and Ekurhuleni. Consider what has happened in Gauteng with Panyaza Lesufi's government. Absolutely gravity-defying political maneuvering. Somebody who's lost so much support and was elected on the premise that he will form a government of provincial unity. Instead, he has gone on as if he governed by himself. And he's done this truly remarkable thing where he's given seats on his provincial executive without sharing any power. And the parties that weren't accommodated as MECs were given committee chairpersonship. That's a wonderful cocoon of cozy co-option. And the other day, the IFP, one of the parties that have accepted a position in the Lesufi provincial executive, complained and he doesn't consult. He doesn't want to share power. And this is a party in Gauteng who's agreed to take up a portfolio in the Lesufi's government called e-government. Who's ever heard of e-government? It used to be a small unit in the finance department that was spun off specifically to give to the IFP, got no significant budget, no significant decision makings. And yet this member, honorable member of the Gauteng legislature, having signed on his terms of political surrender and subordination, wants to complain that he's not being consulted with about how to govern. In Johannesburg, the ANC has fronted two mayors from Al-Jamar, who I think we can agree are less than equal to the task of governing such a city, while leaving the commercial business of the ANC to cadres such as Cilliers Brink, no relation, and Helen Boertes. In Tshwane, the ANC has equally got the mercurial Herman Mashaba to give his support to them and to bring them back to power. Hand back power, in fact. And it's important to focus a little bit on Tshwane because that game plan will play out in different areas. and we have to be ready for it. Fronting a mayor from a smaller party to continue the predominance of the ANC and as a cover for a coalition with the EFF is only the latest technique in a series of techniques or tactics to undo the outcome of an election, and failing which, making the city ungovernable. After 2016, when the ANC lost most of its mayors in the cities, those councillors, and particularly in Tshwane, disrupted council meetings, preventing important decisions from being made. They blocked disciplinary action against the municipal manager who had awarded a rigged tender. Having given cover to this municipal manager, they caused chaos in the administration. They broke Core 8 meetings, and this gave a pretext to the Gauteng government to dissolve the Tshwane Council and place it under administration at the worst possible time, the hard COVID-19 lockdown. Before the intervention of the Gauteng government in Tshwane, the city had a more than 200 million rand budget surplus. After the intervention, after those ANC administrators had been evicted by court order, the city had more than 4 billion operating deficit. No wonder the city fell behind with Eskom. And of course, the ANC would want to blame the DA mayor or the series of DA mayors that Tshwane has had, without taking into account the role of council. You can have as good a mayor as you can possibly recruit. If you don't have a stable council to make decisions, you can't appoint the right city manager, you can't fire the wrong city manager, you can't pass the budget, you can't raise a long-term loan, you can't pass a bylaw, you can't make the fundamental changes to break this network of cadres and tenderpreneurs and provincial government agents. So, what are the takeaways? In order to implement these fundamental reforms in local government, we need the ANC to be the second or the third largest party. No, Mike, the answer is not to form another political party. It takes years and years and years to form an effective organization. Some political parties formed 5 years ago still haven't had an elective Congress, still run by the founder, still struggling to raise the fund because it's expensive to win elections against the ANC, to knock on doors, to have that organization. I think it's a far better bet to fight for value for taxpayers' money and a limited, focused role of the state. A developmental role, a role of helping the poor, but also a role of facilitating investment, economic activity, not simply raising taxes or creating new taxes to plug a budget deficit. There is a lot of anxiety in this country about the ANC losing power, but us not seeing the changes which people voted for. But let's be clear. The ANC is still the biggest party. They might be tanking in the poll, but don't underestimate them. They still have command of a lot of government resources, which typically get deployed a few weeks before the election to intimidate, to bribe, to cajole. Do not underestimate the ANC. But also realize their refusal to share power, their recalcitrant, their resistance to any kind of meaningful change, the failure of the president to articulate a clear joint vision for the future is not because the ANC is so strong. It is exactly because they are in the twilight of their dominance. It is an insecure ANC that doesn't want to bring in the opposition parties and try to even co-opt them, but that rejects all reasonable policy offered. The answer, I believe, for local governments and preparing for the local government election is the long obedience in the same direction. We have to keep on keeping on. We have to position a set of parties in a coalition that are determined to undertake the reforms, to appoint good officials, to give them the backing once difficult decisions have to be made. In conclusion, we had a prime minister many years ago who said that South Africa is the place where the best and the worst never happen. But we have to turn that around. We have to stop settling for not the best and not the worst, because the worst can happen. We must never be lulled into complacency. And that's why it is so very important to fight for the best. Thank you very much.